Hello. Welcome to today's Healthline webinar from the American Association of Kidney Patients titled Innovation in Transplantation, Xenotransplantation. My name is Erin Kahle, and I am Director of Patient Insights, Data Analytics, and Advocacy for AAKP. I oversee our patient research and education activities, as well as our grassroots engagement activities, including our Ambassador Initiative, which falls under our Center for Patient Engagement and Advocacy. AAKP's Healthline webinars fall under our Center for Patient Research and Education. We believe patient and caregiver education is an integral part of treatment and protection of patient lives, and we work to ensure that the patient has a central role in research and guidance that are designed to determine optimal approaches and strategies for providing healthcare services, assistance programs, and access to new products and services. We built this center with the latest polling and engagement technologies to ensure that kidney patients take a central role in informing the federal, academic, and private sector research, shaping the next generation of healthcare services, assistance programs, and innovative new treatments. We encourage you to respond to our flash surveys and other engagement opportunities. We have a very exciting presentation today. At this time, I'd like to introduce AAKP's President, Richard Knight. Richard is a former in-center hemodialysis patient who received his kidney transplant over 15 years ago. Richard?
First, I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. This is truly an exciting webinar. And secondly, I would like to thank Dr. Robert Montgomery for once again spending time with us today. You know, it was approximately 16 years ago when I began my quest for liberation from dialysis by way of a transplant. During that process, I attended a lecture at Johns Hopkins University. One of the speakers that evening was Dr. Montgomery. His topic of discussion was how to do a transplant. He discussed how to do a transplant between a patient and a donor that had different blood types. His words that evening gave me hope. Today's presentation by Dr. Montgomery will provide us with information on a new innovation in transplantation, xenotransplantation. In this example, a pig kidney was used for transplantation. This is an exciting breakthrough that could change the transplant space significantly, and once again, provide that hope that so many of us need. I'm asking everyone who's listening in today and is connected to us, I'm asking you to share your involvement in our online efforts. Your perspective and voice are very important and much needed as we engage researchers, educators, federal agencies, industry allies, as we work with them to bring about increase in innovation and, just as importantly, a move away from the status quo. And while we're in the process of doing this, we need to make certain that patients are involved every step of the way. I'm now going to ask my fellow transplant recipient and AAKP Chair of Policy and Global Affairs, Paul Conway. I'm going to ask Paul to share some insights with us about a recent survey deployed by AAKP that speaks on non-human alternatives to dialysis. Paul?
Thanks a lot, Richard. And like Richard, I'm a transplant patient also. I'm 25 years out on my kidney transplant. We did 3 years of home dialysis. And like Richard, we're always wondering what our next transplant might be. And this prospect of xenotransplant is quite intriguing, not just to us personally, but to a lot of AAKP members. What we'll do is we'll walk through several different slides of our recent flash survey on xenotransplantation. I think the insights will be quite interesting as we go into our conversation with Dr. Montgomery. On the first slide here in our survey, 85% of those in the recent survey were not actually on the wait list for transplant. We actually had a very wide pool of patients, many of whom were first diagnosed, have not started dialysis or just in the first several treatments of dialysis. And it's interesting to see where their perspectives land on this issue. So there's been a lot of talk about artificial, implantable, and wearable organs and non-human alternatives to dialysis, as Richard says, those things which could break the status quo of dialysis care as we know it. And right here, you'll see things that people have heard of, artificial wearable kidneys, about 60%, a little more than 60% on artificial implantable. Interesting thing, nearly 80% of those that we survey had heard about xenotransplantation. And of these, the innovation that initially, in first surveying folks, that they would be interested in seeing come into the market in the next 5 years, you can see right there, it's artificial implantable kidneys. The least popular of the options being discussed among patients is artificial wearable. And you see xenotransplant rate at about 50%, a little over 50%. Here's where it gets interesting. Recently, Dr. Montgomery was in the news for a successful experiment that he conducted at New York Langone with a pig kidney. You can see right here that 75% of those that we surveyed had heard about this. And that's a tribute, actually, to a message getting penetrated across a lot of other news stories to get into the kidney population, that amount of awareness. It's also a tribute to social media, spreading the story among fellow patients. And so another interesting thing, if you were on a wait list for a kidney and an FDA-approved safe xenotransplant was offered, how many would accept it? And it's 75%. Now, the key language in that question is FDA-approved and safe. And this is what kind of proves that point. If you take a look at the highest ratings here of the factors that people would take into consideration, 81% would take into account the clinical trial results, 68% would take into account the approval by the FDA, and 74% are interested in whether or not this would decrease the immunosuppressive drug regimen burden that many of us go through. Personally, I've taken over 160,000 pills since my transplant 25 years ago. So this is something that is a major factor, and Dr. Montgomery will discuss this. And probably the most important is on this last slide, which as AAKP advocates for greater innovation and greater research investments across the federal government and among universities and other institutions. We asked our folks whether or not they'd be interested in accelerating the research in xenotransplantation to make certain that more choices were available and that particular choice was available. You'll see 95%, a pretty overwhelming number. So in summary, what this information shows us is that xenotransplant is an option that's out there. Patients talk about it, they share information about it, and overwhelmingly they're interested in what would be a safe methodology to bring this forward, and would it be FDA approved? What do the clinical trials look like? But overwhelmingly, people want research to move ahead. And this is part of the larger thing that we see with the patient population is there's a great interest, as Richard Knight has said, in breaking the status quo of current dialysis care, coming up with new options and new choices, and xenotransplantation is clearly among them, which is a great thing. And now I'll pass it back over to Erin. Go ahead, Erin.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you, Richard, for opening us up for this wonderful presentation today. I'd like to introduce our special guest speaker, Dr. Robert A. Montgomery. Dr. Montgomery is the H. Leon Pachter Chair and Professor of Surgery, Director of the NYU Langone Transplant Institute. He received his Doctor of Medicine with honor from the University of Rochester School of Medicine. He received his Doctor of Philosophy from Balliol College, the University of Oxford in England, in molecular immunology. Dr. Montgomery completed his general surgical training, multi-organ transplantation fellowship, and postdoctoral fellowship in human molecular genetics at Johns Hopkins. For over a decade, he served as the Chief of Transplant Surgery and the Director of the Comprehensive Transplant Center at Johns Hopkins. Thank you so much, Dr. Montgomery, for joining us yet again, and this time sharing information about an exciting innovation. I turn things over to you.
Thanks so much, Erin, and thank you to Richard and Paul for that amazing introduction that you gave, and the results of that survey, which are so encouraging to me to really hear from patients how much this recent breakthrough has affected their feelings about xenotransplantation. So as I think many of you know, people often ask me, what's your inspiration? I'm a heart transplant recipient, and I've been a patient as long as I've been a doctor and a surgeon. And, it's really that journey that I think about every morning when I get up, and I think as patients, we all feel that progress is too slow. I'm really excited today to share with you a great success story that's been years in the making, but I think we made a forward movement recently, and I want to share with you a bit about that. So I think we'll start first with a video to give you some background. The single biggest problem that we have right now in transplantation is that we just don't have enough organs available. About half of the people who are waiting die before they get a transplant. And everything that we've been doing to try to increase the number of organs available, it's sort of like trying to improve on a failing paradigm. And I sort of think about it as like, fossil fuel, right? You can make it cleaner, you can improve the efficiency, but it's never going to be sustainable. And so, xenotransplantation is sort of like the wind and solar of organ availability. And it would provide us with an unlimited source of organs so that anyone who needed one could have one. The way this unfolded was there was a donor where the family had consented for donation of organs, but they were unable to place those organs. I explained, what we were planning on doing, and that this was an unusual thing. They probably hadn't heard of this opportunity before, but they immediately felt like this is something that their loved one would have wanted, and because she was a very caring individual. One of the reasons that the pig was chosen as the species that would be used for xenotransplantation, first of all, they're relatively easy to genetically modify, and also they're roughly, the same weight and size. In this one case that we've done, there wasn't an immediate hyperacute rejection of the kidney. And in fact, in this genetically engineered kidney that we put in, we didn't see any significant evidence that there was even a microscopic cascade of injury, that was happening in the kidney that we might not have seen by looking at the kidney or measuring the urine output. It tells us that a pig kidney can function normally in a human for several days. It tells us that a pig kidney can be transplanted into human without an immediate rejection. And those two things, I think, are really critical to, giving us the confidence that we can move this out of the non-human primate into human trials. We are going to want to replicate, what we just did. I think there's a possibility of considering extending the study for a longer period of time. And I think, in order to do that, we're going to have to get more input from the ethicists and, the legal community and religious leaders and that sort of thing. What we've been able to learn from the preclinical studies is consistent with what we saw in our study. I think we're probably ready now, within the next year or two, to move to the first in living human trials. I hope that you enjoyed the video. I think it provided a bit of background. I'm going to show some slides now to sort of more fully describe what we actually did. But I do want to just start by acknowledging the tremendous gift that this family made to humanity, consent for their loved one to participate in this study, the first time that a pig kidney has been transplanted into a human for a relatively short period of time, about 2.5 days, but we learned a tremendous amount from this. So, everyone, I think, is aware of this crisis that we have in organ availability, where we only are able to provide organs to about a quarter of the people that need a life-saving organ every year. And this graph on the right side of the screen really illustrates this. In pink are the number of people who are waiting for a transplant. 90,000 people are waiting for a kidney transplant. As was alluded to earlier from the survey, this only represents a small portion of the people who are on dialysis. There are about 750,000 people on dialysis who aren't meant, most of them, the vast majority of them, are never considered for a transplant. And, part of the reason why is there just aren't enough organs. And so, to list people, we have to actually believe that they'll be able to get a transplant before they become too sick to benefit from it. And if you could imagine if suddenly, overnight, we had an unlimited supply of organs, many more people could potentially receive a transplant rather than staying on dialysis. And I think that's a really important point to make. So, I alluded to sort of the wind and solar of the future, and really kind of focused on xenotransplantation from pig organs. But there, aside from the artificial kidney, there is another opportunity, and I'm sure most of you have heard about 3D printing or using scaffoldings. In some cases, you can take a pig organ and remove all the cells, decellularize, so that you're just left with the scaffolding of the organ, and then lay human stem cells on top of that scaffolding and basically reconstruct an organ. And, on the left side of your slide there is an example of, either a liver or lungs that are being worked on right now, that we're collaborating with a group. And, it's getting pretty far along to the point where we can start to test these organs. On the right side of the screen, of course, is really what the focus today is, and that's xenotransplantation. And I'm sure many of you have heard of CRISPR and different ways now that have really these tremendous advancements in allowing us to knock out certain genes in the pig genome that may represent an incompatibility when those organs are placed in humans. And so, there is this sort of new opportunity CRISPR and other types of genetic engineering have provided to make pig organs more like human organs. And the principal problem, just going to run through some of the major barriers that have existed to xenotransplantation and tell you about how we're addressing those problems, and in particular how we addressed them in this study that we just did. So there are certain sugar molecules that are expressed on pig cells, basically all the cells in the pig, that were lost during evolution from pig to human. So humans no longer express those sugar molecules, and so we have what are called natural antibodies. And you know that antibodies attack foreign invaders, and most of the time that's bacteria and viruses and things like that. But in this particular case, it's an organ. It's a molecule on the surface of the cells in the pig organ. And we have these antibodies, very high levels of them, that cause the organ to be immediately rejected. And this has been the major barrier to xenotransplantation for the last 50 years. And this is what we've been able to really address with the genetic editing. But there are also other problems. One is there's an incompatibility in certain regulatory switches in cells in important pathways. And a lot of these these incompatibilities, though, can be overcome with certain medications. You can also make genetic editing in some of those pathways as well, although we chose not to do that in this particular pig that we used. And then, of course, there's this concern of, could there be viruses and bacteria that could be transmitted between a pig organ and a human? And the one we worry the most about is something called porcine endogenous virus. And I'm going to address that in the next couple slides. And then there's been some, all of the work up until this study that we just did in pig to human or pig xenotransplantation has been done in non-human primates. And those outcomes, have been variable, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then address a little bit about, what do we need to worry about that maybe that our study, which only involved a short period of observation, didn't quite cover. So we're going to talk first about the porcine endogenous virus. One thing that's really important is that there are about 160 people who have received tissues or cells from pigs, okay? And in these 160 people who have been studied very carefully, there's never been any evidence that there's been any transmission of viruses or bacteria, and in particular, not of this porcine endogenous virus. And we have a really good way to detect that, sort of like almost like a kit that we can use to detect this. And in fact, in the study that we did, anyone who came in contact with the subject of the study that received the pig organ is being monitored and undergoing surveillance for this. And this is the idea of surveillance for any types of infections is something that the FDA has accepted for xenotransplantation. And again, I alluded to, the outcomes of transplanting pig organs into non-human primates. And, on the left side of the graph is the survival in days of the organ, in this case, kidneys, that have been transplanted from pigs to primates. And you can see that over time, along the bottom is calendar year. And you can see over time, the survival of those organs has improved steadily. And in 2021, we now have kidneys in non-human primates that are functioning up to 2 years after transplantation. Now, it's actually very difficult to do transplants in primates and to maintain those primates with a xenograft because they're just very hard to care for. And actually, people think that doing these transplants in humans is going to have better outcomes and be a lot easier because it's just much easier to care for a human than it is a primate. So why have we spent the last 50 years sort of stuck in, studying xenotransplantation only in non-human primates? Well, I think a lot of the reason is it's just such a big jump to go from a primate to a human, and we just don't know how translatable, the promising data is from primates when we're thinking of doing a first in human trial. So the idea that we and others have come up with is there an intermediate step? Is there a way to test these organs that doesn't involve putting a living human at risk? And so the idea is that if you had someone who was declared brain dead, who we tried to place their organs, but their organs were not suitable for transplantation. So this is somebody who wanted to donate their organs when they died, and their family wants that. But unfortunately, for whatever reason, the organs can't be used. And that's a very disappointing moment for a family. If you can imagine, they're in the middle of grief and a crisis, and they get this additional information that they can't fulfill the wish of their loved one. Well, this provides a different way of donation. In this case, the decedent is donating their body to be kept on a ventilator for a period of time, and what the ethicist decided was reasonable was 2 to 3 days, because that's how long it takes normally to allocate and procure organs for transplantation. Most brain dead donors are kept, in the ICU for 2 to 3 days before their organs can be removed and transplanted. So the idea is for these high stakes kinds of studies where there's no really other good way to test something, that this would be a reasonable thing to do for a person to donate their body for a study, in this case, the study of a xenograft, to see if it's going to be okay initially and there's not something catastrophic that's going to happen when we do a xenotransplant into a living human. We spent the last 5 years working on really, setting up how to do this. And this is not a completely foreign concept. Brain dead donors who have decided to donate organs, and maybe one or two of those organs are not okay to be transplanted into someone, they can, and any of you who have checked those boxes, at the Motor Vehicle Bureau or online, can donate your organs for research if they can't be used for transplantation. So we already have that concept. And also the idea of anatomical donation, or donating your body to science, is something we've known for a long time. So we brought together a lot of ethicists, legal experts, religious experts to really vet this idea. We also had to really, interact with all the regulatory agencies to get their guidance, the Department of Health, particularly, due to concerns about transmitting infections and things like that. This all culminated in, September 25th, when we had this wonderful family that made the decision to donate their loved one's body for this study to see if there would be any problems initially when we do a xenotransplant in a human, since that hadn't been done with a pig organ before. So this was a genetically edited pig that this kidney came from, and we knocked out in that pig the main sugar that we have these natural antibodies against. And you can see we didn't put the kidney in the usual place that many of you are familiar with, where kidney transplant goes, which is in the abdomen, because we wanted to be able to see the kidney, the whole time, and also take biopsies so we could look at it under the microscope and see if there is any evidence of rejection. And so we placed it really at the top of the thigh, where there are two blood vessels, an artery and a vein. We sewed it to that artery and a vein, and so that the decedent's blood was being circulated through the kidney, and we could capture the urine and look at the urine output, and also, have access to the kidney. So you can see on the right side of the screen, 54 hours after we did the transplant, the kidney looks perfect. It looks just like a human transplant, making lots of urine. And I won't go into all the details, but this slide basically shows you that the transplanted pig kidney made between 100 and 500 cc's of urine every hour throughout the 2.5 days that it was studied. It resulted in a lowering in the creatinine of the decedent. The decedent had an elevated creatinine because they had been through a terrible trauma that had resulted in brain death, and the creatinine came down from 1.9, which is abnormal, to a normal level of 0.8. So we know that the kidney worked in a compatible way and functioned well. And I won't go through this in detail, but these are biopsies that were taken at different time points after the transplant that show no evidence of rejection, no evidence of those antibodies attacking the kidney that we were concerned about, that have always resulted in a failure of xenografts in the past when they've been tried in a human. And, I just want to give you sort of a view of what's coming on the other aspect of this, which I mentioned earlier, which is bioartificial organs. So in this case, you can see a bioartificial set of lungs in the foreground that are being ventilated, and the decedent, so, again, doing the same kind of study, rather than testing a xenograft to test a bioartificial set of lungs, and the decedent's blood being circulated. It's a little different. We because the lungs require ventilation and, a different set of circumstances than a kidney, which really just needs a artery and a vein to function. We're going to test this in what we call an ex vivo apparatus, but the same idea. You get a sense for how well the organ works and whether there's any kind of an immune response. So you can see that this concept of whole body donation and for these breakthrough types of tests of organs that are alternatives to human organs are really something that show tremendous promise. So, it took hundreds of people who were involved in this study. And we also, stand on the shoulders of all the individuals who've been involved in the genetic editing of pigs and the primate studies and primate surgeries, who have done this tremendous amount of work that allowed us to get to this point where we were able to move this now into humans. And as I mentioned in the video, I think we're not very far really from moving this forward to the first in living human trials. And I would say maybe 5 or 10 years from now, I believe after those initial trials, that this is going to become more of a routine thing and really expand the options for individuals who have end-stage renal disease and end-stage disease of other organs. I think, the next thing along the line is probably hearts, and we're working on that as well, which will obviously have a lot of additional personal meaning to me. I'm happy now to take any questions and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Montgomery. We have collected several questions from our webinar registrants, so we hope you can address some of them today. Many of these you have probably covered in your presentation, but it will be beneficial to our audience to have some of these points reiterated. So the first question here is, can I volunteer for a clinical trial?
Yeah, so, again, that's a really important question. We've had a lot of people call the office who say, I would love to be the next person to get a pig kidney. And I think your survey showed really well that that people have a lot of, for the most part, people have a lot of confidence in our regulatory agencies and in the FDA. The FDA has said, they are giving us guidance in terms of the first in living human trials. And, they have felt pretty strongly that, we should limit those first trials to people who, are unlikely to survive, waiting for an organ, and would benefit from an organ that, based on what we know just from the primate studies, might only last for a year or two. Sometimes I feel like we've got these very heroic individuals who want to, make a contribution and would be willing to take that risk, that reasonable level of risk to be in these first trials. But I think our regulators are really going to insist that we identify patients who really don't have any good alternatives and are unlikely to receive a human organ in time, and might even benefit from a year or two of having a functioning pig organ.
Thank you for that. One other question we have, what are the potential risks of expression of swine viruses into humans?
Yeah, so we discussed that a bit, and the main one of concern, is the porcine endogenous virus. Now, it's not a real virus. It is some type of an ancient virus that actually now is part of the DNA of pigs. Okay, and other animals have these, portions of viruses that have become encoded and have found kind of spliced into the genome. And the concern is, could they come out of the genome and form actual active viruses? And that's why they're called endogenous, because they're part of the DNA of the pig. And they occur in up to 65 different sites throughout the pig genome. But again, in all of the individuals I mentioned, the 160 people, living humans who have received pig tissues or pig cells, this has never happened. It only, has ever appeared to be a possibility in a petri dish when you sort of mix, pig cells with human cancer cells, right, that are dividing very rapidly. But all of the evidence really up till now is that it's an unlikely event, an extremely unlikely event, and that the main thing is that we take tremendous precautions. We do these early studies in a thoughtful way. We monitor the recipients of the pig organs very carefully, and we have good testing now to do that. So I think that can be done in a very safe way. And of course, we've just made some contribution to that because we have surveilled, the decedent plus all the individuals who were involved in the study, for these porcine endogenous virus. And we haven't seen any evidence that there's been any, potential infection. So this is a surmountable concern and risk. And again, I think it's just important that anyone who's involved in this research just takes the proper precautions. And we did all of this work in an isolation area where we built a ICU and an operating room just for this purpose, away from any patient care areas.
Wow, it's such an exciting topic. I know there's a lot of questions out there, but it sounds like this is something that has been in the works for quite some time. It's just exciting to hear about it now. What would the anti-rejection regimen be for a xenotransplant? I know you mentioned that with this experiment, the recipient didn't have any signs of rejection, but would there be anti-rejection medication? If you could touch on that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. So, again, this was a short-term study of several days, and and it really was the type of rejection we were looking for was from this preformed antibody, which you see immediately. And again, it's been the reason why there's never been a successful pig organ transplant into a human. And by knocking out, the target for the antibodies that cause that type of rejection, we didn't see that at all. But there's, other types of rejection that occur later. And, we don't have from this study a complete sense of, how significant that is going to be. But of course, we do have the primate studies. And so what it looks like right now is that individuals, who would undergo a xenotransplant would need lifelong immunosuppression, at least as strong as those who get a human organ. But, we did something very interesting in this study. In addition to doing the genetic modification of the pig kidney, we transplanted the pig's thymus along with the kidney. Now, the thymus is where our immune system gets educated, and it gets educated to be able to distinguish between the good guys and the bad guys. The good guys are your own tissue. You don't want to attack your own tissue. That's what happens in autoimmune diseases, right? And the bad guys are anything that looks like it's not you, that's not self. And that would include all types of infections and in this case, tissue from another species. So what we want to do with that thymus is really addressing the question of the long-term risk of rejection. And the thymus, because it educates the immune system, in this case, we're asking it to re-educate the human immune system to not recognize pig molecules, pig antigens, as being something foreign. And the hope is somewhere down the line, by transplanting the thymus along with the kidney, that we might get tolerance. Tolerance is the state where an organ is not seen as something foreign that needs to be attacked. And so our hope is, with this, the genetic editing to eliminate the risk of early rejection, and the thymus to re-educate the human immune system to prevent the chronic type of rejection, that we might be able to, at some point in the future, withdraw immunosuppression, which would be the holy grail for transplantation.
Thank you. Do you have an estimate on the average length of time that a xenotransplant could last?
Yeah, so all we know now is really based on the non-human primate studies, which now for a kidney, we have organs that are surviving up to 2 years. But again, I alluded to this earlier. We actually think, and based on this study that we just did, where we didn't see any early rejection at all, which you often do see in the primate, I think really that these kidneys are going to do better in humans. But we're not going to know that for sure. That's just a hunch. It's really hard to convince a primate to take their immunosuppressive drugs. Sometimes it's hard to convince a human to do that too. But I think it's actually that xenotransplantation is going to work better in humans. But right now, when we're consenting a patient in these first trials, we'll have to tell them that what we know now is maybe the best you could hope for is 2 years, just based on the data that we have.
Someone who has already had a transplant get a xenotransplant. And a second part of that question, if a xenotransplant is performed and that's rejected, will that prevent the recipient from receiving a human kidney transplant in the future?
Yeah, so that's a fascinating story that we don't have a complete answer for. And the question is, if you do a transplant and it fails, is that going to put you in a worse position maybe to get a human organ in the future? And we don't know that for sure, but we think that, what the immune system, the human immune system, responds to when it sees a pig organ is very different from what it responds to when it sees a human organ. And there may be some crossover, but it may, if you do a diagram, like a Venn diagram, that crossover may be very small, and that's what our hope is. And that you could go back and forth between, in other words, if you decided to take a pig organ, that if that failed, let's say in 2 years, you could get relisted for a human organ. And I think there's every reason to believe that would be the case. And if you had a human organ before, that you could receive a pig organ.
Wonderful. And I know you touched on this a little bit earlier, but how long do you think it will be before xenotransplantation can really be used in humans? And I know you mentioned clinical trials and that sort of thing. What do you think the timeline is for that?
So the clinical trials I think are pretty close, the next couple of years, and then we'll have to, the FDA will want some long-term data, outcome data. So we'll have to wait some period of time before, the FDA will decide whether or not to approve it. And, there are some new ways of predicting, based on information um, from certain markers and, using big data sets and artificial intelligence to take a relatively short window of data and use that to predict what might happen in a year or 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. So I do have some confidence that even though, the FDA is going to want longer term data, that they may be able to predict what those data are going to look like based on shorter term time points. And, my hope as someone who's, laid in an intensive care unit, not knowing whether an organ was going to come available to me in time, that um, that we'll be able to move forward for wider spread use, um, in a reasonable period of time once we know this is safe for people.
Thank you so much. Well, we very much appreciate your time today. Are there any final thoughts that you would like to share on this topic with our audience?
Well, something that I alluded to, before. So about a third of the people who are waiting for kidneys, have had some exposure to other human tissue before, either through pregnancy, blood transfusions, or previous transplant. And they've developed antibody. It's called sensitization. It's something I've spent my whole career studying. And this could potentially be, a solution for them because, there is so much difference between pig and human that, potentially a sensitized person who can't be matched with a human organ could potentially be matched with a pig organ a lot easier. But again, we're still trying to fully understand that and whether there's any cross-reactivity of those antibodies. But I think there's some recent data that are really promising. So, there are a group of patients who really have tremendous trouble finding a match for a human organ and wait for years, decades. And maybe this could be a solution for them too.
Thank you so much. Well, on behalf of AAKP, we greatly appreciate your time, your dedication to helping patients, all of your research and your efforts on this new breakthrough. It's just really exciting, and we're so thankful for your time and being willing to share this information with us today.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Erin, and thank you to your wonderful organization, that provides these services and really allows, patients to have access to these new ideas and to individuals who are, working in the field, trying to innovate, trying to move this thing forward so that this becomes an even greater success story. Thank you.
Thank you. If anyone listening today has a question that was not answered, you can reach out to us at info@aakp.org, and we will work with Dr. Montgomery to provide a response. We hope you have found this webinar informational, and I'd like to close with just a few slides about some additional resources that may be of interest to you. If you're not already a member of AAKP, we encourage you to join us. We offer free membership to patients and family members, as well as living kidney donors. You can join online or by phone, and in order to receive all of the benefits of membership, please be sure to include your email address when signing up. You will be notified by email when opportunities arise where your opinions and experiences are needed to help inform innovation, advance care, and make a meaningful impact to improve lives. We encourage you to respond to our flash surveys and other engagement opportunities to help us elevate the patient voice and change the status quo for kidney disease care. You can also select to receive any of our 5 different electronic newsletters and subscribe to our print magazine, AAKP Renal Life. We also invite you to follow us on our blog and social media for all the latest news and announcements. AAKP is dedicated to helping patients understand their condition and take control of their health care. We are proud to offer a variety of resources for both patients and caregivers. We also offer numerous kidney-friendly recipes with details on the nutritional content and which stage of kidney disease these recipes are good for. By visiting our website at aakp.org and clicking on the AAKP Store button at the top of the page, you can find a variety of educational brochures and online tools to order or download, and you can also order materials by phone. We encourage you to visit our on-demand webpage where you can find educational sessions from our previous events, such as our Global Innovation Summit, Policy Summit, and National Patient Meeting. As we are still in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, we are continuously updating our resources page, and you can find that by clicking on the big red button from our aakp.org homepage. I'd again like to thank today's speaker, Dr. Robert A. Montgomery, for sharing information on this exciting new innovation in transplantation. We thank you for joining us today. We hope you will continue to be informed and stay safe. Thank you.